But you can see it, but
Welcome, everybody. I am delighted to welcome you to the CRLT Jacobs Speaker Series, and I'm particularly delighted that we have Susan Jurow here speaking. Susan is an associate professor of educational psychology and learning sciences at the University of Colorado Boulder. Her research explores how learning is situated in changing social and cultural practice. And her scholarship has focused on studying and designing for learning progressive social change. And indeed, I'm particularly excited because Susan is one of the leaders in this all too recent turn towards social justice in the learning sciences. So, she inspired, I think when we did the handbook of the learning sciences, somehow that was something we left out, and I got in touch with Susan at the very last minute. And while the Politics of Writing Collective didn't feel that they could do much at that point, it inspired Suraj and I to at least get a couple of paragraphs that are in the introduction. So we may not have completely gotten it right.
We solved it.
But thank you for helping us think of those things. Sure. And really, I think helping bring this as something the learning sciences needs to be thinking about. So,
all right, cool.
All right, I'm going to use the clicker for the first time ever. Thank you so much for bringing me out. It's already been really fun. I just want to say, and Kim's not in this room, Kim Dunning, she's amazing.
Yeah.
She's nice. Everything was so delightfully, so that was amazing. All right, so thank you for, I'm going to play with some ideas here today. And some of them are new. I've talked about a few of these ideas at a keynote that I did at the Learning Sciences Grad Student Conference, and this is slightly different. So we'll see how it goes. Okay, and I also want to mark, and I'm happy to talk about the art in this at the end, but I like thinking with art. I think it gives us different ways of imagining possibilities, and it breaks us out of how we ordinarily think about our experiences in our world. But I'm not going to keep talking about it at every slide. Okay. So I'm going to put this down now. Okay. So the question I'm posing for us to think about today is, how can we design for spaces of radical openness and possibility in the learning sciences? So I'm using the phrase radical openness and possibility, which I borrowed from the cultural critic and feminist scholar Bell Hooks, as a way of enriching how we talk about equity in learning sciences. So equity is a first step for addressing problems of oppression, but we need to develop richer language and concepts that can capture people's desires for different ways of living together. So designing for radical openness and possibility is a way of challenging the political and social order as a way to develop theories of learning that can, as Chris Gutierrez and I have written about, embody lived arguments for the possible. So let me read a quote from Bell Hooks' essay titled "Choosing the Margin as a Space of Radical Openness," that's inspired this talk today. So she writes, "I am located in the margin. I make a definite distinction between that marginality which is imposed by oppressive structures and that marginality one chooses as site of resistance, as location of radical openness and possibility." So for Hooks, the margin is not a place to, as she writes, give up or surrender as part of moving into the center, but rather it is a site one stays in, clings to even, because it nourishes one's capacity to resist, to imagine alternatives, new worlds. So radical openness and possibility signifies a generative space for liberty, a space alive with continual engagement, play, and the remaking of cultural and historical relations that can create flourishing ways of being and becoming. So radical openness and possibility is fundamentally about learning, in my view. This type of learning has a deeply ethical dimension. It is about creating new forms of collective life and ways of being with care and compassion with others in the world. So this desire for radical openness and possibility is why I am and why I remain a learning scientist. Learning scientists study and organize for learning that can generate new forms of knowledge, new ways of knowing, and support the development of people and institutions. So doing this work well demands that we work in deep relation with others and maintain humility in order to see and understand how we are developing towards ends that are not yet there, which is a quote from Uriah Engstrom. So today I'm going to speak about the aspiration of my learning sciences research to become a location of what Hooks describes as radical openness and possibility. So in chorus with a number of my colleagues, I argue that the learning sciences would have a greater positive impact for education if we talked about and wrote about more explicitly the ends towards which we're designing, our values, and our social interests. So what are the ethical responsibilities of learning scientists? And what should be the endpoints of our designs? One way that I've been thinking about generating radical openness and possibility in learning sciences has been through the development of social design experiment methodology. So social design experiments, which Chris Gutierrez and others, including myself, have been developing for over 2 decades, is a different way of thinking about the purposes, the processes, and the outcomes of design in the learning sciences. Social design experiments, is it weird that I'm like blocking it? Are you okay? You still see it? Okay. Social design experiments begin from a place of hope and possibility, stemming out of the reality that there are many groups of people who have been and continue to be oppressed and harmed as a result of systemic injustice. Social design experiments involve working on problems with people who have faced these injustices to address oppression directly. Social design experiments strive to make possible a dignified life for all humans, address challenges of social inequality through leveraging cultural diversity, aim to transform systems, are oriented toward the co-design of new futures, and focus on the greater theorization of learning as a social, cultural, and historical process. So let me provide some background on the Learning in the Food Movement project, which is the project that I ran with a group of my students and community members. That's going to provide a grounding for my discussion of designing for radical openness and possibility. So our project on learning in the food justice movement was organized to contribute to how learning scientists have conceptualized and investigated social practice theories of learning. It was focused on the development of new forms, new cultural forms of knowledge and identity in contentious collective action. And it's centered on equity-oriented social change across scales of practice organized by community members. So social movements created through the actions of people challenging the status quo have great potential to create lasting and meaningful social change. That said, the learning sciences, especially at that time, had not taken up social movements as an arena for investigating learning. That's changing, and actually Joe Kernow and I, who's a colleague of mine in Canada, we have a special issue in the Journal of Learning Sciences focused on social movements and collective organizing. So I hope that people will take a look at that, and maybe even, I gotta plug my own stuff, and I hope that you will consider sending in a manuscript to consider for this issue. So anyhow, this is what we were doing. We were looking at social movements as a way of rethinking what learning could look like. So the community-based nonprofit with whom my team and I worked for about 5 years is a group we call Impact. Impact was founded by 2 white men who grew up in the state and who wanted to improve the quality of life for people in the most marginalized city in the state. So they located their efforts in what we call South Elm, a historically immigrant neighborhood that was both marginalized in the city as a result of policies and economic investment, and resourceful in terms of community activism to improve the safety of the neighborhood, education for its young people, and pride in its immigrant community. So at the time of our study, the co-founders of Impact served as the nonprofit's executive director and director of operations for the organization. Impact's staff also included 8 promotoras, 7 women and 1 man from the community. The promotoras were all recent immigrants from Mexico who were primarily Spanish speakers, but all of the promotoras also spoke some English. So as the Impact website describes the promotora model, community health workers, they write, can be found in every nation and culture. The promotora model has been used extensively in Latin America and has recently, since the 1950s, been applied in the United States to bridge gaps between people and resources in rural and underserved communities. From personal to environmental health, promotoras are advocates for change and work to create thriving, resilient communities for their families and neighbors. So the founders of Impact recognized the value of using an asset-based approach wherein they could use the promotora model in South Elm to leverage the shared cultural practices and language backgrounds between the promotoras and the residents in the neighborhood to facilitate desired health and social goals. So Impact, do this, there you go. Impact initially focused their energies on improving access to healthy food in South Elm. So the U.S. Department of Agriculture had categorized South Elm as a food desert, and that is a contentious category, but the people in the neighborhood did not have easy and affordable access to healthy food in the neighborhood, healthy and fresh food in the neighborhood. So Impact's most successful and long-standing initiative is its backyard garden program. So through this initiative, residents are supported in designing and growing their own backyard vegetable gardens with educational and material support from the nonprofit. So the promotoras plan the gardens with the residents. They prepare the ground, which is back-breaking work in some cases, where you're actually tearing out old trees to make space for gardens. The promotoras regularly attend to the gardens. They go out to the neighbors, and they help them learn to weed. They help them identify what are weeds and what are actually like herbs you might want to have, and they help them harvest. And every time they would go out into a backyard, they would weigh how many pounds of vegetables were being produced, but they were also doing a lot of social relational work, just connecting with community members. So this is one of the families in the neighborhood, and they actually, the father in this family has become a member of the nonprofit, like he actually gets paid to do work for the nonprofit. They live in an apartment in this, behind them is the apartment complex. And so they live in one of the apartments, and what they've done is they've taken over the whole front lot of the apartment building, and it's full of vegetables. And because it was such a success, they also there's a big parking lot where people park their cars, and then next to the parking lot is another lot, and they took that over too. So they have a huge plot where they just have tons and tons of vegetables growing. And every time I went to visit them, they live right by the main office, I would leave with like eggplants and watermelon, like squash. And they'd always ask like, what was I creating? Like, what was I cooking with all this food? But so this is just an example, but the whole neighborhood has like a lot of people in the neighborhood. There are now, I'm off script, there are like 1,600 gardens. So this is a map of that the organization created. The green dots are the gardens. This is how many, look at the number of gardens in the neighborhood now. And this is a food desert. People have been growing food, sharing food, and what Rogers Hall and I have written about is that it's like the concept of community itself has been changed. it's materially changed. Ideas about what it means to be in community and to share food with each other has changed the way people think about the relationships they could have with each other, and the relationships they can have to place and to the city itself. So now that I've gone completely off script, I'll jump back into it. I'll just say that the Backyard Garden program has been enormously successful, and people in the city, across neighborhoods in the city, have been paying attention to what they're doing here. And when we first joined with the organization, the executive director and the director of operations were particularly interested in working with us because they did want to take this model into other neighborhoods in the city. Right? But before they could do that, they were really curious, like, what is the Promotor model? And that was how we entered into this space as people, as educators who could help them develop a curriculum. And I say it in quotes because that's not what I do, but I was like, okay, I'll get in this way. This will be a good way for me to understand what the Promotoras and the nonprofit were up to. So from a structural change perspective, Impact has worked with city, private, and national funders, along with residents, to develop a cooperative market where neighbors can sell their produce to others in South Elm and to residents in other parts of the city. So no joke, if you have ever seen a garden this big, there's a lot of vegetables that everyone is producing. And there were so many vegetables that they realized that they needed to sell the vegetables. And so in addition to the co-op is a place for buying and selling produce, but it's also an educational kind of facility where people are learning how to preserve food, how to can food, and actually starting to create their own little businesses where they're selling like salsas, for example, and learning how to become business people in the neighborhood. So during the 5 years during which my team and I collaborated with the nonprofit, the organization grew and its needs shifted. So in relation to that, I played many different kinds of roles, sometimes at the same time. I was a researcher, a professional development designer and leader, and I became, on request of the Promotoras, a member of the Impact Board of Directors. So the story of our research project, the neighborhood's changing circumstances, and my shifting role, all those things are deeply interrelated. So understanding these shifts and why they took place and how they changed our collective work is a critical but often under-investigated dimension of design research. And I think it has implications for the ethical dimensions of our work and how we are theorizing learning. So some of the arenas in which I believe that we as learning sciences researchers need to develop greater sensitivity include being responsive to what we notice and our choices regarding with whom we stand, how we organize consequential change, and not only who we are, what we bring to situations from our histories, but also who we are becoming through our relations with people, places, and tools. So I'm going to share how my team and I approach these issues in the Learning in the Food Movement project in order to draw attention to how designing for radical openness and possibility involved ambiguity, humility, and empathy. So practically, in terms of how we operationalize these dispositions in our work, we participated in community activities and read widely and deeply so as to help us apprehend the lived experiences and political realities of our community partners. We engaged in participatory design with community partners to create new social and material relations aimed at democratizing power and influence across scales of practice. And we acknowledge as our chosen responsibility the need to learn and to act differently in response to a dynamic flow of concerns and possible futures. So I'm going to walk you through some of these decisions that we made. So we began our project with a broad ethnographic overview of the food movement in a 3-city metropolitan area. So what we noticed were that there were many groups that were focused on healthy and sustainable food, and smaller number of groups organized around food justice. So according to the lexicon of food, food justice refers to a wide spectrum of efforts that address injustices within the U.S. food system. Weak forms of food justice focus on the effects of an inequitable food system, while stronger forms of food justice focus on the structural causes of those inequities. So a year into the broad ethnographic phase of our project, we made a decision to focus on groups committed to strong forms of food justice, because we, like the people we were studying, recognized the need to organize for lasting structural changes to the food system. So we spent about another 6 months analyzing the food justice dimension of the food movement in order to understand its variations and its contradictions. We also began getting to know the people who were part of the different groups, assessing their willingness to allow us to learn from them, and getting a sense of where our contributions might be useful. So based on systematic comparison across groups and writing about what we were learning, we decided to join in with Impact. And I do want to pause for a second. It's not like I went in with a plan then we're going to do this at 6-month mark. Now we're going to do this new thing. It wasn't like that. We were just trying to figure out what's going on in this really complex place of the food movement, and what in the world, or what could we do in this space, because we really did care about the issues that all these groups were working on. And I went to the food movement originally because I cared about food, but I also recognized it wasn't just because of what it could do for the learning sciences. I lived in this city. I saw the effects it was having on communities, and I came from UC Berkeley, which is the home of, Berkeley is the home of the local food movement. I've always cared about food, and I recognize its consequences on people's lives. So we did this work, and we learned all this stuff. But really, we were always trying to think, how could we join in with a group that could really make consequential changes, right? So we chose to work with Impact because they were the only group at that time that was really leveraging the assets of the historically oppressed community that they were serving in order to generate solutions. So other groups were focused on what geographer Julie Guthman describes as bringing good food to others, wherein people working in white cultural spaces and from a missionary stance aim to educate poor people of color about a particular set of valued food practices and bring them healthy food to which they believe poor people of color would not otherwise have access. We did not want to participate in that kind of activity, and we've actually found ourselves at some times doing a little bit of that work and then realizing we don't want to do that, right? And then recognizing that we should write about that, decisions that we're making. So the orientation of Impact, in contrast, centrally viewed the community as part of the solution aimed at structural reorganization. So the choices we made in this early phase of the project were value-laden, and they shaped the direction of our research and our designs. We identified a group of people and a dense set of practices that were already working towards radical openness and possibility. We joined in with them because we both wanted to learn how they were doing this work and how we might collaborate with them to deepen what they were doing across scales of practice. I will make a comment about this in a second. Let me start with the big theme. So our capacity to revision and organize consequential change with others relies on recognizing how we are connected to each other and seeing our lives and our struggles as linked. So this is a picture. My house is 2 doors down. This is my neighbor's backyard. We hosted, this is my graduate student, former grad student, Leah Teeters. This is my daughter. we hosted this fundraiser in my neighbor's backyard. She had a good sized backyard to raise money for promotoras to get professional development for the work they were doing, because they were not getting that at the time when we first joined in working with them. And I'm put this up here and I'm pointing out like that my daughter's there too, because I believe that when we do the kind of work that we do for real change and structural change, it is reliant on the relationships that we build with people and recognizing our struggles as connected to theirs, not as something that like, that's what they're dealing with. Though they were like 8 minutes from my house, I could have just shut out that whole neighborhood from my experience. But rather than doing that, we definitely felt like there was a lot more linking that we were doing together. And I think that really did deeply involve having my family be part of what they were doing and bringing them into our kind of broader social worlds. So in my work with Impact, my team and I focused on the experiences and work of the promotoras. I mean, that was the group we decided we'd join in with. We did this not only because our entry to the organization was focused on enhancing the professional development of the promotoras, but also because we noticed the ways in which the promotoras were always working hard with minimal resources, for little money, and with significant positive effect on building solidarity and social change in the neighborhood. So my team included women in academia. We recognized what they were doing, and we saw some of our own struggles in the work that the women were doing. And I'm not saying that like that's the whole reason we did this work, but that was definitely a part of it. And it was also a significant part of why the promotoras trusted us and let us be part of their community. So in our work with the promotoras, we used art, theater and political activism activities, and writing to do the work of like understanding the promotora's job. We also use more typical forms of data generation and analysis to make sense of the historical organization of the work, of their work, tensions in what they were doing, and how these tensions could be productively transformed. So my research team and the promotoras leveraged our diverse forms of expertise and our networks to engage in this joint work. The university team used our disciplinary training and professional experiences as designers, researchers, and teachers to organize interventions with the promotoras. We strategically drew on our academic networks across disciplines, financial resources from grants, and our social and cultural capital to enact responsive and sustainable designs. So the fact that I used my neighbor's backyard is one of those ways in which we use our sort of social and cultural capital. A lot of the people who came to the fundraiser were people that we knew. It was not people from the neighborhood we were asking to give money. It was us asking our friends and our broader network. So the promotoras also drew on their networks of influence in order to do this work with us. They had networks that extended across the city, and they drew on their expertise as gardeners and community advocates to initiate and revise designs for improving their professional practices. So together, we developed new data collection and analysis tools, new organizational structures that could support the promotora's advancement in the nonprofit, and different ways of making visible and communicating the promotora's worth to the nonprofit leadership and to the city more broadly. This is the outside of the office where the promotoras worked, or where their computers were located. And this was in the middle of developing a mural on the outside of the building. I actually liked this better than the end mural, but I actually liked this because you can see there's a ladder there and people were like making it, right? And it was cool to me that it's like in this organization that was headed by white men who are wonderful and highly educated, the decision to make the mural not be a white man, but a brown woman who was breathing life into the neighborhood is pretty significant. So let me talk about our actual designs. Like, what did we actually do that kind of embodied what I'm calling and playing with the idea of radical openness and possibility? So in terms of like what our specific designs built on, the assumptions are that the organization of social and material infrastructure, Joshua, I know your lights are lighting up, the infrastructure makes particular knowledge, skills, and identities consequential. And how power is constituted and contested, that power and knowledge is constituted and contested through the development of method and discourse. Okay, those were starting assumptions for us. So our aim was to organize designs in which the promotoras could develop ways of knowing, being, and becoming that could support their increased capacities for self-determination. That's what we were really trying to do. And as an example of how our designs reorganize the social and material relations that impact to support radical openness and possibility, I'm going to tell you about the Promotora app. So we co-designed the Promotora app, a tablet-based application in collaboration with colleagues in the Department of Information Communication, Technology and Development. Okay, to make visible the routine yet not fully appreciated relational dimensions of the Promotora's work. So I've included this image as like a kind of quick way of explaining what was going on at the organization. So in the organization, the Promotoras were doing all the gardening work. They were the people going out and actually breaking the ground, bringing the seeds, dragging out the compost, doing all the work of putting in the garden. That manual labor, right, was documented. It was documented. I put these pictures of reams of paper because it was being documented with pencil and paper that promotoras were like writing down what they were doing. It'd be like this stack of papers that you're carrying around. They were doing that. And the organization wanted them to do that because they were getting their funding from national funders who wanted to know about what are you doing to bring poor people good food, right? That's what they wanted to know. How many pounds of tomatoes are you growing in the neighborhood? That's important. I'm not saying it's not. It's actually fundamental to why it was such a success in the neighborhood. But the other things that the promotoras were doing that we recognized from going out in the fields with them and driving around the neighborhoods was that this is the lead promotora, who we call Veronica. They would all meet with people in the neighborhood. And you'd like walk in. I would do it too. You walk into people's like backyards, and soon you would be invited into their house for drinks. You'd be sitting down and making sure they want to make sure you have a snack while you're there. They'd be cutting the vegetables so you can taste how good they are. And as you were doing that with them, they would tell you about the problems they were facing. And there were a lot of problems that they were facing because this was a neighborhood without access to strong institutions. There's limited money flowing to this part of the city. And so actually in this scene here, this is a grandmother talking about going back to Mexico and then getting hurt on the beach in Mexico, not having the health insurance so that she could get her foot checked out in Mexico, came back to the United States and was like struggling with this foot. She didn't have insurance. And Veronica was providing her not only with like ideas about what she should do and like how to take care of the foot, but also people in the neighborhood who had knowledge that she could now direct her to, right? And because the promotoras were the people who were running all over the neighborhood, I mean, they were driving in their own cars all over the neighborhood, they knew a lot about what the resources were in the neighborhood so that they could start linking residents to resources. And so the blank here is because nobody at the time when we started working with the organization was collecting any information about that. And the reason why for the promotoras this was so important, this gap, and they didn't recognize it when we first started working with them, but we all recognized it as we started talking. They felt that by not documenting that, number one, that was a huge part of their work, okay? And number two, they wanted professional development around how they could do that job better, because they were not trained social workers. They were just good, trusted, caring people, but they knew they needed more resources. So they wanted something that could help them document what they were doing so that they could get better at it. And that's what happens when I go off script. So now I'm like, okay, somewhere in here. What was I going to say? So one thing that we really wanted to do also is that if we can make this work visible and get them support for it, we saw what they were doing in the neighborhood, both aspects of all this work, as fundamental to the success of the social change in the neighborhood, right? And the promotoras felt that their work was not sufficiently valued. Part of that not being sufficiently valued is that people did not see it. The people in the office did not know all that they were doing. They certainly knew they were going out to neighbors' homes, but they didn't know what they were doing when they were there. So we wanted to make that more visible. So we learned about the extensiveness of the promotor's work through listening to them and observing them in multiple contexts, in professional development workshops, in interviews, on drives through the neighborhood, but also on visits to the gardens. On this one, here I am. We came in to put in a garden. I was there to document, and the woman whose home this was is from the Philippines. She made a lunch, a full-blown lunch for us. Had all the promotors and me sit down, and then the conversation actually turned out to be about, so she's from the Philippines, about the history of colonization in the Philippines and how it's so connected to the experiences of the promotoras. And they were really surprised, the promotoras. I won't say the woman's name, but her name sounded like they were wondering, like, why does she have a Mexican name? Why does she have a Mexican name? And then the person who owned the home said, it's not a Mexican name. We share a history of colonization. And then they had this like amazing conversation over a meal. Those kinds of conversations happened fairly regularly in the neighborhood. That was an important place where I got to learn about what was going on. And this is a picture from a much more formal, fancy fundraiser that we were doing which is another important kind of work that the nonprofit needs to do. But I also learned about what the executive director and director of operations needed in order to keep the organization running. So it's not that we ever our team never looked at the guys who were in charge as the bad guys in the situation. There were no bad guys in the situation, but they had different kinds of power and different ways that they were using that power to advance the social justice mission of the group. And so I think what was really important I wanted to show here is that we were in both spaces. And so were they sometimes, but not always. So what I saw as an important part of our job was making visible and of value what the promotors were doing in the spaces where the executive director and director of operations were not visible, right? Or not present. And that was hard work, and it was not always welcome work that we were doing, because we bring up stuff that was hard for the leaders of the organization to hear. Right? So let's see. So based on what we learned from working across all those spaces, we did learn what mattered to the promotoras, but also what mattered to the nonprofit leadership. So we decided together, and this sounds more straightforward than it was. We decided together that what the promotors needed was a dynamic way of documenting what they were doing, a way that allowed them to document what they were doing, and a way for them to share what they were doing with people who could help them solve problems like on the spot. And because I had been talking with people across my university about a variety of issues that were happening in the neighborhood, I connected with a colleague who was working in the field, the development field, and I say that in quotes. And she came up with the idea of maybe not just having like a loose leaf binder, which was our original first idea. I probably wouldn't be here talking to you about loose leaf binder, but a loose leaf binder that would like have all the problems the promotoras were facing and solutions that they could go back to and look at. And we were like, no, why don't we just make like an app? It'd be easy. We could make it really cheaply. So that's what we do. That's what we did. So this is a picture of one of the promotoras, the only man who is planting in the garden. This is one of our promotoras who was field testing the app. And actually in the back is one of the guys from one of the technologists who was working with us. And this is not clear to see, and I don't know how to make it any better, but this is from a mural that's a child made in the neighborhood at one of the gardens, and it says, to have a community, we need to grow people. And I've put it there because I really think what's captured here is the ways in which what the promotoras had been doing originally, just planting, meeting people, that was amazing. We didn't design the app so I could write an article for Learning Sciences Journal. We designed the app because the promotoras really felt they needed more. They wanted business skills. They wanted to be analyzing data. They wanted to be telling their own stories about what they were doing. And the original organization of the documentation processes were that the promotoras would jot down on paper the stuff that they were doing. They never jotted down like, oh, I had a conversation with so-and-so about how our child is facing mental health issues. They would never do that, but they document all the rest. They bring it back to the office, and one of the directors would input that information into an Excel file at one computer. And so what that does, you can easily imagine, is he has all the expertise. They were not allowed to develop new kinds of expertise. They were not learning to analyze data. They weren't able to interpret the data. And it was their story that was not getting told fully, right? So with the change in what we did with them, they were now hands-on the technology, right? One of the things that was really important about this is that they could just take pictures of stuff that were going on, so they wouldn't have to use a lot of language around what they were doing. And it was like immediately shared with people who could help them. So they wanted to design something that was like Facebook, that like you could post something and like many people can now respond to what the problem was in the field. So what we were doing in this design was what Chris Gutierrez and I have been talking about as a syncretic approach to design, which is a strategy that leverages historically valued practices and extends them into the future to create new possibilities. So the historical practices are the practices of the promotoras. And what we're doing is adding this technology piece that changed those practices of the promotoras. So before we started our project with the promotoras, this nearly invisible work that they were doing was not often discussed in the organization, and it was not sufficiently valued, and it was not supported with professional development. The promotoras wanted to design a tool like the Promotor app so that it could help them collect information about how they were interacting with residents in the neighborhood and what resources they could use to advance that work. So since the introduction of the Promotor app into the Promotor's daily practices, they've been able to harness the opportunities supported by the app to secure new community grants for their advocacy work. And the first one that they were awarded focused on their desires to end domestic violence in South El. And I will note that was not something that the nonprofit leadership even recognized was a significant problem in the neighborhood, but it's what they were facing almost every single time they were in homes. and they realize that people need greater education around domestic violence. So the Promotores and our experiences designing and using the Promotor app resonate with Hooks's notion of radical openness and possibility when she writes, "We come to this space through suffering and pain, through struggle. We know struggle to be that which pleasures, delights, and fulfills desire. We are transformed individually, collectively, as we make radical creative space which affirms and sustains our subjectivity, which gives us a new location from which to articulate our sense of the world." So being transformed through organizing for radical openness and possibility is part of the work. It is an essential, though often overlooked way in which we are learning. We don't often examine this part of the work as part of our research process or research stories, which are typically centered on our findings, but it's a significant motivating force behind what we do, how we do it, and why we do it. So critically reflecting on what changes us in our projects can alert us to how our ideological commitments and our ethical perspectives are developing and shaping our designs as well as their effects on the world. So with that perspective in mind, I want to share how I believe I have been transformed through this work. So in an article I wrote with Leah Teeters, who's over here, we described how relationships de confianza mediated the successful community organizing that was taking place in South Elm. So relationships de confianza are characterized by mutual reciprocity and commitment. So they fundamentally involve listening and responding to the needs of others with whom you have strong interpersonal relations. So in our analysis, the relationships de confianza that the Promotores developed with residents served to build strong relational networks by which the community change was able to take hold. So in thinking about our designs for radical openness and possibility, the notion of relationships de confianza is also helpful, I think. So the relationships that the Promotores developed were not only with the residents in South Elm in this project, but also with us, the researchers. Through our sustained engagement with the Promotores and with Impact, we researchers came to be seen as trusted colleagues and friends. The Promotor app was one of the more spectacular ways in which we responded to the tensions and problems that the Promotores were trying to address. But we, in relation with them, found other ways to develop understanding of their lives, to build solidarity with them around shared concerns, and to care about each other. We've been profoundly influenced by the theories, analyses, and actions of the Promotores, a group that, again, represents the community that are the most affected by oppressive policies and practices, but among the least heard and understood. So by working with them, we have learned to listen in a way that was similar to how they listened to residents. We listened in order to act. Our actions were guided by the Promotores in a dialogue between what they believed they needed and how we thought we could respond. So as an example, since we began working with Impact, the South Elm neighborhood has changed and has become attractive to gentrifiers, as has our whole city. Impact, ironically, in some ways, but not if you know anything about nonprofits in neighborhoods like South Elm, has been part of this development, has been part of making the neighborhood more attractive to gentrifiers. South Elm now has a lot of beautiful and productive gardens. It has a cooperative market selling produce grown in the gardens. And it has improved thoroughfares that include bike lanes and street lights and a profusion of murals along main streets that were inspired by the community's pride and hope for the future. The city in which South Elm is located has also changed. The local food movement had a lot of momentum in the city and where we were doing our work. New flows of money, people, and ideas have contributed to the growth of the city to become a major destination for migration in the US and for urban development. So South Elm, a largely poor and immigrant neighborhood with limited resources, but just 15 minutes from the city's downtown, has become newly attractive to people who would not have considered living in that neighborhood before. So gentrification has become a serious threat to the community's survival. So following the election of Donald Trump, the problem of gentrification was exacerbated by new concerns with deportation and community safety. So as members of a largely undocumented population, South Elm residents' experiences with housing have become increasingly precarious. The promotoras were going into all these homes and hearing stories about corrupt landlords who were preying on residents, right, because of their undocumented and unprotected status. As the nature of what was consequential to the community shifted, our research and my role in the community needed to shift as well. So at that point, I accepted an invitation to work in collaboration with promotoras and residents on a new housing campaign. And I was asked by the Impact Board of Directors to come and speak with them about gentrification and what it means for community members. And no, I am not an expert on this topic, but what they recognized about me was that I had, from their perspective, a lot of time on my hands. I could go and, go learn about gentrification, go study, go talk to experts, then come back. So they really came to recognize what I could do for them. I could help them design a survey for collecting data on people's experiences with their landlords, for example. So what happens in that kind of way, that little brief example, describes the ways in which this project and new agendas and new ways of participating in the community emerge over the course of people's lived experiences. These are the real problems people were facing. Not all of these new directions developed into research projects. So the housing campaign work, for instance, did not. Part of identifying what would become an arena for research and design included determining interests from the people involved, honestly assessing whether we or I had the time and resources to do the work well, and figuring out whether we had or could develop the necessary expertise to do the work. So another consideration for all of us, and this includes graduate students, is that we needed to consider whether we could commit to engaging in the new work with the community for the aim of generating radical openness and possibility, right? This might mean, it did mean, not pursuing questions or solutions in ways that we or my students wanted or other faculty wanted to. This is a significant concern because meaningful work with communities is not always what is taken as consequential in academia. That's a serious thing. I feel like we need to talk more about that because I did say to people who wanted to work on this project, no, we're not doing that. We're not doing, yes, it would be super cool to develop that kind of technology to work with, in this community, to get it used in the community. But I was like, for what end? That nobody wants that. Nobody wants that. You want that, and that sounds cool. Don't do that on this project. Don't do that with me in this project, right? I think those are hard decisions, and I think we need language to be able to talk about that with our students and our collaborators. So even when agendas, though, did not become sites for research, they did contribute to deepening the relationships that we were developing with the promotoras and our partnership, in our group. So in fact, and I've said this before, when I look back on it, those decisions not to do research were some of the most important research decisions I made. So it's notable that each shift in the project required my team to bring in new collaborators with expertise that could help us develop ways of responding to newly named problems. And remember, this is a neighborhood without an enormous amount of infrastructure and institutional support. So there were a lot of problems coming at you all the time. So we did work with technologists, business school entrepreneurs, and lawyers. Doing this led us to use different tools, different methods and strategies, which pushed us to appreciate new ways of thinking and acting for the future. So this is characteristic of the work of community organizing in which the promotoras were always engaged. So we learned from the promotoras how to participate in this type of principled improvisation rooted in clear ethical positions. The shifting nature of our research, designs, and participation was a mirrored response to the shifting nature of injustices that people in the neighborhood were facing. This movement within our project and ourselves speaks to what it means to work towards radical openness and possibility. So this project changed me as a researcher, and it's helped me sharpen and refine my understanding of the ways that contexts change and the effects that this can have on what and who matters. So it also changed me personally, as it helped me to feel in a different way than I had before how oppression functions, I'll finish in a second, and changes its form over time and space, and how it affects differently positioned people in different ways, and how it demands that we act together fearlessly to challenge it. I will end on this one slide. We won't get there. I just want to say these last few things, that learning scientists must address our ethical responsibilities. Our designs are value-laden, and they have political effects. You may not know what those political effects are. None of us will know, but it should not make us be paralyzed into inaction. Designing for radical openness and possibility can lead to transformation, like as I've talked about this whole time, of ourselves, our practices, and our institutions. And this is collective work that involves deep relational engagement that can change both how we develop knowledge and how we advance our common good. I had like 100 more slides. Well, in there, I'll put it in there. I've done this work with so many people. Thank you. That's okay. I wasn't even paying attention at the end.
So we have about 2 minutes for questions.
2 minutes.
2 minutes. So can we have, you can take a few questions.
Mickey, I know your name. Yeah.
So I'm curious, since you sit at this intersection, between these different communities and local experts and what they're doing, and then outside, like, how do you manage that tension of you're not a housing expert and you're going to then engage in that important research at the intersection? Like, what strategies do you use to win over the housing experts in that case?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, that's a very hard problem. I feel like my training as a graduate student with Rogers Hall, I did do that work. Like my entire graduate school career was about like figuring out who were the right people to put into a room together. Mm-hmm. And I think that's hard work that we don't often, I feel like I learned that through an apprenticeship. Mm-hmm. But I actually think we need to explicitly talk about those decisions we make, because you're making decisions about, like, I think, like, are these good people? Because I'm only bringing good people into the space with the promoters. Do they have their values at heart? That's hard to figure out. I spend a lot of time, I spend an enormous amount of time getting to know people before I ever like bring everyone into a space together, because there can be real damage done in those relationships, and promoters have no time to do that kind of like figuring out if, Joshua is going to be a decent person in the space. Mm-hmm. And then what usually happens is when you meet a good person who's a lawyer, who's doing immigration law, they know other good people. And so then it just becomes this like a huge group of people working together. So I think that's
so you'd say it's mostly about relational,
I definitely
your
about
ability to connect
Yeah.
rather than know everything about that.
Oh, no. But I will say I do read
Sure.
widely. Like even if I'm bringing in somebody who's like a legal expert, I will go read about what they're doing from the kind of social justice perspective, and then I keep on reading about learning in those spaces. Mm-hmm. See what I? Yeah. You got like 5 seconds to ask another question.
One more question.
Oh.
I'm always here for you, Susan. Do you want to talk a little bit about the art in this PowerPoint and how you were thinking about what it does?
So a lot of the art that was in here is actually from the neighborhood, and I think that we need to be thinking about art and activism. It's obviously a way that a lot of people, my husband always reminds me, oh, the Nazis used art too. They do. That's right. It's an important way of changing the way people experience themselves. Like, I think that we're underestimating how important it is for what we can understand about other people's experiences. Where's one that I really like? I mean, the murals are everywhere. The murals connect to, historical traditions of protest. I think we just haven't been spending too much time, but I want to keep on going on and on. I mean, you can see in lots of cities, I don't know if this is true here, but where I'm from, the city where I am, there are a lot of murals. There's a very lively public art scene. So there's a lot of murals everywhere, and it's certainly getting connected to, of course, it's all connected to kind of the neoliberalism, but we might want to pay attention to that in our learning sciences research, because I do think it's about transforming places and making them more meaningful to people.
Okay, well, thank you.
Oh,
We've got
thank you.
Pizza out of the